I knew something was wrong the moment the impact driver started rattling against the side of my house. Not near my house, not somewhere down the block, but against the actual wall beside my kitchen, hard enough to make the coffee mugs tremble in the cabinet. By the time I stepped outside, my neighbor had already decided that part of my home belonged to him, and he looked genuinely offended that I had a problem with it. Back then, I lived in a little row of townhouses on the edge of Fairmont, Indiana, the kind of place where the streets curled around old maple trees, and everybody pretended not to notice when somebody left their trash cans out one day too long. It was quiet without being lonely, ordinary without feeling dull, and after 9 years there, I knew the rhythm of the neighborhood the way some people know a favorite song. Garage doors opened around 7, school buses groaned past at 8, sprinklers clicked on before sunset, and every Saturday morning somebody fired up a lawnmower before the rest of us were emotionally prepared for it. My place was the end unit, a modest 2-story house with pale gray siding, a narrow backyard, and a sidewall that sat only a few feet from the property line. It was not impressive, but it was mine, and I had put more care into that house than I had put into almost anything else in my life. I had replaced the windows myself, painted every room twice because I picked the wrong colors the first time, rebuilt the front steps with my brother, and planted hydrangeas that took 3 years to stop looking like they wanted to die. The house had become part of my identity, not because it was expensive, but because every scratch and repair carried some memory of me refusing to give up on it. My neighbor was a man named Mason Crowley, and when he first moved in, I honestly thought we would get along. Mason had one of those personalities that filled up whatever space he entered. Loud laugh, quick handshake, always ready with a story about somebody he knew or something he had almost bought. He worked in used equipment sales, which suited him perfectly because he could talk about a broken lawn tractor like it had survived combat. At first he was helpful, even generous. He lent me a pressure washer one spring, helped me move a workbench into the garage, and once climbed onto my roof to retrieve a branch after a storm. But over time, I started seeing the part of him that only showed up when somebody told him no. Parking rules were stupid. HOA notices were harassment. Noise limits were for people with no personality. And permits were, according to Mason, just a way for the county to steal money from hardworking men. Whenever somebody questioned him, he would grin and say, "Nobody cares that much." It became his favorite sentence. And eventually I realized it was not really an observation. It was a challenge. He kept pushing boundaries because every time nothing happened, he took it as proof that the boundary had never existed. The trouble started on a Monday morning when a delivery truck dropped a massive stack of treated lumber in his driveway. I was leaving for work at the time, and Mason stood there wearing sunglasses and holding a tape measure, looking proud enough to be opening a hotel. I rolled down my window and asked what he was building. He slapped the top board and said, "Backyard paradise." I figured he meant a small deck or maybe a platform for a grill. Nothing that involved me, so I wished him luck and drove away. That evening, concrete forms had appeared along the narrow strip between our homes. On Tuesday, there were deep holes in the ground. By Wednesday, thick posts stood upright like fence towers, and by Thursday morning, the frame of a raised deck had climbed almost level with his kitchen door. That was when the knots started forming in my stomach. The structure looked too wide, too close, and far too ambitious for the space available. I searched for a permit card in his window, a contractor sign, an inspection notice. Anything that suggested somebody qualified had looked at the plan. There was nothing. Just Mason, his cousin Rick, and another guy named Dale, moving lumber around with the confidence of men who had watched several online tutorials and decided professional training was mostly a scam. Friday afternoon, I came home early because a client canceled, and before I even got out of my truck, I heard the nail gun firing from the side yard. I carried my coffee around the house and stopped so suddenly some of it spilled over my hand. The deck was not merely close to my exterior wall. A thick ledger board had been pressed flat against my siding and secured with large lag bolts driven directly through it. Fresh curls of vinyl and wood lay beneath the wall, and one bolt head was still shiny from the tool. For a few seconds, I genuinely tried to invent an innocent explanation. Maybe Mason thought the wall was shared. Maybe he believed the property line ran somewhere else. Maybe he had spoken to someone who gave him bad advice. Then I looked up and saw him watching me from the half-finished deck with a drill hanging at his side, and the expression on his face told me everything. He was not confused. He was waiting to see whether I would make trouble. "Mason," I called, keeping my voice calm. "Why is your deck attached to my house?" He glanced at the ledger board, then back at me, and laughed like I had asked why rain was wet. "That is the strongest place to anchor it," he said. I stared at him. "The strongest place for your deck is my wall." He shrugged. "It is not hurting anything." "Did you ask me before drilling through my siding?" "No, because I did not think you would care." That answer landed harder than the bolts. I stepped closer and pointed at the fresh holes. "You attached a load-bearing structure to property you do not own." Mason leaned against the railing frame and smiled. "You are making it sound dramatic." "It is a deck, Owen, not an oil pipeline. My name is Daniel Mercer." But Mason had called me Owen 3 different times since moving in, usually when he wanted to remind me how little attention he paid when other people spoke. I corrected him once more, mostly out of principle. "Daniel, right," he said, still smiling. "Look, Daniel, this is how people build things when they do not want to waste 6 months begging the county for permission." I asked whether he had pulled a permit. He rolled his eyes. "Nobody pulls a permit for a deck." I told him to stop working until we sorted out the damage and the property issue. His smile changed then, losing whatever friendliness it had left. "Not happening," he said. "I have people coming over next weekend, and I am finishing this today." Then he lifted the drill, turned his back on me, and drove another screw into the frame while I stood below him. That sound changed something in me. Until that moment, I had been trying to preserve the relationship, trying to speak neighbor to neighbor, trying to give him room to correct a reckless decision without losing face. But when he turned away, I understood that he did not see my patience as kindness. He saw it as weakness. I went inside, set my coffee on the counter, and stood in the kitchen listening to every strike and burst of that power tool travel through my wall. I was angry. But underneath the anger was something colder, a feeling I had not expected. The realization that a person I had trusted with tools and small favors had decided my home was simply available for his convenience. Early the next morning, before Mason brought out his saws, I called the Brookfield County building office. A woman named Carla answered, and after I explained that my neighbor had bolted an elevated deck directly into my house without permission, her casual tone disappeared. She asked for the address, whether construction was still active, whether there was a permit displayed, and whether the structure crossed the property setback. I told her everything I knew. The call lasted less than 7 minutes. When I hung up, I expected paperwork, delays, maybe a letter in a month. Instead, 4 days later, I turned onto my street after work and saw a white county truck parked in Mason Crowley's driveway, and beside it stood a gray-haired inspector holding a clipboard while Mason pointed angrily at my wall. The inspector was a man named Harold Vance, late 50s, silver hair, wire-frame glasses, and the kind of quiet posture that made loud men suddenly aware of how much noise they were making. Mason was already in full performance mode by the time I walked up, one hand on his hip, the other waving toward the deck as if he were presenting evidence in court. I heard him say, "This whole thing is being blown out of proportion," just as Harold crouched beneath the frame and ran a flashlight along the joists. He did not answer right away. He measured the spacing, checked the hardware, pressed one boot against a post, then stood and walked toward the narrow strip between our houses. Mason noticed me and his face tightened. "You really called them," he said. I looked at the bolts in my wall. "You really gave me no reason not to." He opened his mouth to respond, but Harold lifted one finger without looking at either of us, and somehow that tiny gesture shut the whole scene down. He stepped into the side yard, examined the ledger board, then placed his palm flat against my siding and traced the line of fasteners with his eyes. "Who owns this wall?" he asked. "I do," I said. Harold looked at Mason. "Do you have written authorization from the property owner to attach this structure here?" Mason gave a short laugh and said, "Come on, it is a townhouse. The walls are practically shared." Harold turned toward me. "Is this a shared wall?" "No. My survey puts the line inches beyond the siding." Harold nodded, removed his glasses, and looked at Mason for a long second. "Do you have a building permit?" Mason crossed his arms. "I was going to file after I finished." "That is not how permits work," Harold said. The sentence was plain, almost gentle, but it seemed to take all the air out of Mason's chest. Harold kept inspecting. He measured the distance to the property line, checked the footing depth with a metal probe, photographed the connections, and asked who had designed the structure. Mason said he had built decks before. Harold asked whether that meant he was a licensed contractor. Mason said licenses did not make people smarter. Harold wrote something on his clipboard. I had to look away so Mason would not see me trying not to smile. 25 minutes later, Harold pulled a bright orange notice from his folder and fastened it to one of the new posts. Stop work order. Mason stared at it like someone had stapled an insult to his chest. This is ridiculous, he said. Harold gathered his tape measure and replied, "You may appeal through the county office, but no additional work is permitted until the violations are reviewed." Mason looked directly at me then. "You happy now?" I was not really. I looked at the deck, the fresh wood, the railing sections stacked nearby, the cooler already sitting by his back door, and I felt something closer to sadness than satisfaction. "This could have been avoided," I said. "You could have asked." He shook his head as though I had betrayed him and walked inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. The official report arrived 6 days later, and that was when the problem stopped being a neighborhood argument and turned into a financial emergency. I received a copy because the structure involved my property, and the report listed 7 separate violations. No permit, improper attachment to an adjacent building, insufficient footing depth for local frost requirements, missing lateral load connections, incorrect joist hangers, no flashing behind a ledger board, and encroachment into the required setback. I read the list twice. I had expected the bolts to be the main issue, but the deck was wrong in almost every way. A deck could be wrong while still managing to stand upright. Harold's notes said the attachment created a risk of water intrusion and structural transfer into my exterior wall. One section warned that snow load and deck movement could damage the sheathing beneath my siding. Another stated that the footings were too shallow and could shift during freeze-thaw cycles. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with that report spread in front of me, feeling my anger change shape. Before then, I had thought Mason was arrogant. Now I understood that he had gambled with my house because proper construction had seemed inconvenient. That evening, he knocked on my door holding a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had rehearsed a softer voice. "Daniel," he said, "maybe we should talk like adults." I almost told him we had already tried that, but I stepped onto the porch and let him continue. He said the county was being overly technical. He said the deck was solid. He said Harold was the type of inspector who enjoyed finding problems because it made him feel important. Then he opened the folder and pulled out a 1-page form. "All I need," he said, "is your signature saying you do not object to the wall attachment." I took the paper and read it. The wording went beyond simple permission. It attempted to give him ongoing access to my property for maintenance and shifted responsibility for future damage into a vague shared arrangement. It was the kind of document someone printed from the internet at 2 in the morning and hoped nobody would study closely. "You want me to accept liability for something you built without permission?" I said. Mason's jaw tightened. "That is not what it says." "That is exactly what it says." He leaned closer. "Look, I already have almost $12,000 in this thing. My wife promised her sister we would host the graduation party next month. If you sign, I can fix the other issues and we can all move on." For one brief moment, I saw what had been driving him. It was not just ego, though there was plenty of that. His wife had spent years comparing their home to her sister's larger place across town, and Mason had decided the deck would prove they were doing just as well. He had bought expensive furniture on credit, ordered a grill he could not afford, and invited half the family before the first post went into the ground. Pride had turned the project into a deadline, and the deadline had turned every rule into an obstacle. I understood the pressure. I did not excuse the choice. I handed the paper back. "I cannot sign this." His face hardened instantly. "So you are really going to ruin me over a few holes?" "No," I said. "You drilled the holes. I am refusing to pretend they are mine." He left without another word. Over the next 2 weeks, contractors came and went from his property. The first stayed less than an hour. The second brought an engineer. The third spent most of an afternoon taking measurements and shaking his head. Mason kept trying to save the structure by changing one piece at a time, but every solution exposed another problem. Moving the outer posts would not fix the illegal wall attachment. Rebuilding the footings would not solve the setback. Making the deck freestanding required redesigning the beams, the stairs, and nearly the entire support system. The engineer's final opinion was blunt. Demolition and reconstruction would cost less than bringing the existing deck into compliance. Linda Barrett from 3 doors down caught me at the mailbox one evening. and lowered her voice as if the houses themselves were listening. "I heard he's in for 20 grand already," she said. I told her I had not asked. She gave me a look. "Nobody has to ask around here. News travels faster than cable." I laughed despite myself, then looked toward Mason's house. The orange order was still attached to the post, faded slightly by rain. I did feel bad for him. Losing that kind of money would hurt almost anyone. But every time sympathy rose in me, I remembered standing below the deck while he laughed, remembered him calling me the wrong name, remembered the drill biting into my wall after I told him to stop. Regret does not erase intent. It only arrives after the risk stops feeling worth it. Mason appealed the decision, argued that the setback was outdated, claimed the county had approved similar decks, and even suggested my complaint was retaliation over an old parking dispute that had never happened. Harold responded with photographs, measurements, and code references. There was no drama in his paperwork, which made it impossible to fight. By the end of the second week, the county issued its final order. The deck could not be modified in place. It could not remain temporarily. It could not be grandfathered. It had to come down completely, and all damage to my home had to be repaired by a licensed contractor at Mason's expense. The morning the demolition crew arrived, Mason stood in his driveway with both hands in his jacket pockets while two workers unloaded saws, pry bars, and heavy tool cases. I watched from behind my kitchen window as one of them climbed the stairs Mason had proudly finished only days before. The first railing section came loose with a sharp crack, then another, and another, and by 9 o'clock the deck had started disappearing piece by piece. Mason did not look angry anymore. He looked smaller, like the confidence that had built the thing was being hauled away with the lumber. Around noon, the crew reached the ledger board attached to my wall. The supervisor called me outside before removing it, and when the board finally came free, we saw 11 deep bolt holes punched through the siding, some surrounded by crushed vinyl and exposed sheathing. 11 holes, all hidden behind a structure Mason had insisted was not hurting anything. The supervisor exhaled slowly and said, "Good thing you caught this before winter." Then he pointed to a dark line beneath one fastener where rainwater had already begun working its way inside. I stood there staring at that small stain, realizing how close confidence had come to becoming permanent damage, and behind me, Mason said nothing at all. The repair crew spent the rest of that afternoon opening the damaged section of wall, replacing the compromised sheathing, sealing every penetration, and installing new siding where the bolts had crushed the old panels. They documented each step for the county, photographed the waterproofing, and waited for Harold Vance to return before closing everything up. Mason paid for all of it. I knew that because the contractor made him approve every change order, and each time another piece of damage appeared, Mason's shoulders dropped a little lower. By sunset, the deck was gone, the dumpster was half full, and the narrow side yard looked strangely wide again. There were tire marks in the grass, sawdust scattered across the dirt, and fresh patches of earth where the footings had been pulled out. But for the first time in weeks, nothing touched my house that did not belong there. I stood in the kitchen staring through the window long after the workers left, expecting to feel victorious. I did not. What I felt was relief mixed with disappointment, the kind that settles in after an argument when you realize winning did not repair the relationship. Mason and I had lived side by side for years. We had traded tools, watched each other's homes during vacations, complained about the same icy roads and the same rising taxes. All of that had been replaced by 11 bolt holes and a bright orange notice. For the next several days, we avoided each other. If I stepped outside, he went in. If he was checking the mail, I waited. A neighborhood noticed, of course, because neighborhoods always notice. Linda tried not to ask questions directly, which only made her questions more obvious. Dale, one of the men who had helped Mason build the deck, stopped by one evening to apologize. He stood near my driveway with both hands in his sweatshirt pockets and looked genuinely embarrassed. "Mason told us you had agreed to it," he said. "He said the wall was basically shared." I believed him. I asked whether he had seen any written permission. Dale shook his head. I asked whether anybody had checked the property line. Another shake. "Then why did you keep drilling after I came outside and told him to stop?" Dale looked toward Mason's house before answering. "Because he said you always complained about everything and you would get over it." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because I cared what Mason told people, but because it confirmed the part I had been trying not to believe. He had not made a rush mistake. He had created a story in which my boundaries did not matter, then used that story to make everyone around him comfortable ignoring me. Dill apologized again and offered to help with anything I needed. I thanked him, but there was nothing left for him to do. The county had already made sure the repairs were done correctly, and Harold signed off on the wall the following Monday. When he handed me the inspection copy, he glanced toward the empty side yard and said, "These situations usually start small. Somebody assumes a few inches do not matter. Then a few inches become a foundation, and a foundation becomes a lawsuit." I asked whether the county saw many cases like this. "More than you would think," he said. "People get comfortable with the idea that quiet means consent." That line stayed with me because it explained Mason better than anything else had. I had been quiet for years. I had overlooked his parking habits, ignored late-night power tools, moved my trash cans when he blocked the shared curb, and laughed off comments that irritated me. I thought I was being easygoing. Mason thought I was teaching him that I would never push back. About a week after the repairs passed inspection, I found him at the mailbox. It was early evening, cold enough that both of us could see our breath, and for a moment we stood there pretending to sort envelopes that did not need sorting. Finally, Mason said, "Cost me more than $27,000. I looked at him. "I am sorry it got that far." He gave a bitter little laugh. "Are you?" I thought about it before answering. "I am sorry you lost the money, but I am not sorry I protected my house." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the street. "My wife is furious. Her sister's graduation party is at their place now." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. After a moment, he added, "I really thought nobody would care." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no anger, just exhaustion. That was the first honest thing he had said since the project began. I asked him why he believed that. He shrugged, but it was not the same shrug he had given me beneath the deck. This one looked smaller. "I have always handled things myself," he said. "Permits take forever. Inspectors nitpick. People complain. Then nothing happens. I figured I would finish it before anybody could stop me. And my wall." He closed his eyes for a second. "I thought you would be annoyed. Then let it go." There it was. The whole story reduced to one assumption. He had not believed the wall was his. He had believed my objection would be temporary. He had counted on my discomfort with confrontation as part of his construction plan. I told him that was the part I could not forget. The deck was expensive. The violations were serious, but the real damage happened when he looked at my home and decided my permission was optional. Mason nodded, then quietly said, "I get that now." We never became friends again. Not in the way we had been before. We became polite. We waved. We spoke when snow needed shoveling or delivery was left at the wrong door. A few months later, he hired a licensed contractor and built a smaller freestanding patio entirely inside his property line, complete with permits, inspections, proper footings, and enough paperwork to make him miserable. Harold came out twice during construction. Each time, Mason stood beside him listening carefully, asking questions and taking notes. I watched from my window and could not decide whether the sight was satisfying or sad. Maybe both. The neighborhood eventually moved on. Kids rode bicycles past the empty side yard. Linda found newer gossip. The torn-up grass grew back, and the story of the illegal deck became one of those local legends people told new homeowners. But when I think about it now, I do not remember the demolition first. I remember the sound of that drill traveling through my kitchen wall, and I remember Mason smiling as though my home were simply a convenient piece of lumber he had already paid for. That week changed how I think about boundaries. Most people imagine boundaries as lines on surveys, fences, rules, or words printed in legal documents. But the real boundary exists the moment one person says stop and the other person decides whether that word matters. Mason's deck came down because it violated building codes. The conflict began because he believed respect was negotiable. So I want to know what you would have done. Would you have called the county the moment you saw those bolts? Or would you have given him one final deadline to remove them himself? Was I right to involve an inspector after he ignored me? Or should neighbors settle these things without government intervention? Even when property and safety are involved, tell me where you draw the line. And if you have ever dealt with a neighbor who treated your patience like permission, share that story in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories about ordinary people, crossed boundaries, and the moment consequences finally come knocking.